There are moments in parenthood when the world tilts on its axis, when a single sentence from your child's mouth rewrites everything you thought you understood about memory, presence, and the invisible threads that bind us to those we have lost. And this is the story of one such moment, a story that begins not with answers but with questions that echo through the corridors of the human heart. Questions about what we see when we look at a stranger, what our children perceive that we might miss, and whether grief truly ever leaves us or simply transforms into something we learn to carry differently, like a familiar weight we eventually forget we are holding. On a Tuesday morning in November, Daniel sat in seat 12A of a half-empty flight from Madrid to Barcelona, his 11-year-old son Marco pressed against the window beside him, forehead nearly touching the glass as they climbed through the clouds, and everything about this trip had been carefully planned, or so Daniel believed. A father and son journey designed to pull them both from the heaviness that had settled into their home like a permanent fog, a fog that had been thickening for 3 years now, since the day Marco's mother, Helena, had stopped breathing, had stopped being the woman who hummed while cooking, who brushed their son's hair back from his forehead with such tenderness that it seemed impossible her hands could ever go still, yet there she was, impossibly still, impossibly absent. And Daniel had learned in those 3 years that grief is not something you survive once and then move forward from, but rather something you learn to reorganize within yourself, like furniture in a room you never chose to redecorate. And this trip to Barcelona, where his sister lived, where there would be distraction and the possibility of small joys, felt like it might be a beginning of something, though he could not have named what. The airplane settled into its cruising altitude and Marco had finally released his attention from the window, the novelty of flight already fading in the way it does for children who have grown up in a world where moving through the sky has become ordinary, and Marco turned back toward the aisle, his eyes scanning the cabin with the restless curiosity of a boy who was learning to be a man too quickly, who had had his childhood interrupted by the kind of loss that teaches you too early about the fragility of the people we love. And Daniel watched his son with the particular ache that fathers develop when they realize they cannot protect their children from the fundamental pain of existence, only from the smaller injuries, only from some of the immediate dangers, but not from the big ones, never from the big ones. That is when it happened, in that ordinary moment of unremarkable flight time, when the beverage cart had not yet arrived and most passengers had settled into their small rectangular spaces with phones and books and the particular loneliness that commercial air travel creates. Marco suddenly stiffened beside Daniel, his small frame going rigid in a way that made every parental alarm in Daniel's nervous system activate. That made his amygdala, the ancient part of his brain designed to detect threat and danger, fire with sudden intensity. And Marco's hand reached out and gripped his father's arm with the focused intensity of a child who has seen something that has arrested all other thought. Daniel turned to follow his son's gaze and saw a man, perhaps 50 years old, with salt and pepper hair and glasses, sitting several rows ahead in the aisle seat, a completely ordinary man wearing a blue sweater, reading a newspaper. Entirely unremarkable in every way except for the fact that Marco's fingers were now digging into Daniel's flesh and Marco's voice had dropped to that particular whisper that children use when they are frightened or confused or both, that whisper that seems to contain the weight of something far larger than the words themselves, and Marco whispered, barely audibly, his breath warm against his father's neck, "Dad, that man, who is he?" Daniel's response came automatically. The practiced response of a father trying to seem untroubled. "A man who is a stranger, buddy, why do you ask?" His hand moving to his son's shoulder with what he hoped was reassuring pressure, but even as he spoke these words, Daniel felt something shift in his own chest, felt his own nervous system beginning to register that something was not quite right, that Marco's reaction was disproportionate to what he was seeing, that his son's body language suggested not mere curiosity but something closer to recognition, and this possibility, this single fragile possibility, began to generate a cascade of neurochemical responses in Daniel's brain, cortisol flooding his system, his heart rate accelerating, his pupils dilating as his body prepared for either fight or flight, though there was nothing to fight and nowhere to flee to, locked as they both were inside an aluminum tube hurtling through the sky at 35,000 feet. Marco's grip did not loosen, his eyes remained fixed on the stranger in the blue sweater, and then he spoke again, this time even more quietly, so quietly that Daniel had to lean in to hear him, and Marco said, "Dad, I think that might be Dad," the word hanging in the air between them like something physical, like something that could be held in the hand and examined, and Daniel felt the world perform a kind of temporal distortion, felt time seeming to both stop completely and accelerate at the same moment, and he understood with a clarity that bordered on pain that his son was suggesting that the stranger sitting 6 rows ahead was somehow, impossibly, Marco's father, was somehow the man they both knew to be dead, buried in the cemetery on the north side of the city for the past 3 years, the man whose urn sat on the shelf in their home because Daniel had never quite managed to decide what to do with it, where to scatter it, how to complete that final ritual that would have meant accepting that Helena was truly gone. The realization landed in Daniel's consciousness like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that would eventually reach every shore, and Daniel found himself unable to form words, found his own mouth suddenly dry, found that his training as a therapist, his years of listening to other people's pain and confusion and bewilderment, had not prepared him for this particular moment when his own child was suggesting something that contradicted everything he believed to be true about reality, about death, about the fixedness of those we have lost, and Daniel's mind began to race through explanations, the kind of explanations that the rational part of himself seized upon like a drowning man grabbing at driftwood. Perhaps Marco had confused this stranger with someone else, or perhaps his grief was playing tricks on him, creating false recognitions, false hopes, the way that Daniel had read about in his professional literature, how trauma and loss can cause the mind to see what it wants to see rather than what is actually there. But even as Daniel's conscious mind was assembling these rational explanations, another part of him, the part that exists below conscious awareness, the part that is connected to something older and deeper than reason, was stirring with a recognition of its own, and Daniel found himself looking more carefully at the man in the blue sweater, really looking at him now in a way that seemed to require an effort that was almost physical. And he saw, with a shock that traveled through his entire body, something in the set of the man's shoulders, something in the way he held the newspaper, something in the particular curve of his profile that echoed something Daniel had lived with every day for 15 years, had known with an intimacy that exceeded language, and Daniel felt his rational mind recoiling even as his body seemed to be confirming what Marco had suggested. The next moments unfolded with a strange quality of unreality, as though Daniel was watching them happen rather than participating in them, watching himself reach out to squeeze Marco's shoulder, watching himself say in a voice that sounded far away, "Stay here, buddy," and watching himself rise from his seat with movements that seemed to require enormous deliberation, as though he was moving through water, or through time, or through the particular thickness that surrounds moments of profound disorientation, and he made his way forward through the aisle of the aircraft, past sleeping passengers and passengers absorbed in their own small worlds of entertainment and distraction, and he arrived at row 18 where the man in the blue sweater sat, and Daniel took a breath that seemed to take up all the oxygen in the cabin, and he spoke. "Excuse me, I am sorry to bother you, but I have a question that might seem strange," and Daniel watched the man slowly fold his newspaper and look up at him, watched the man's eyes move upward to meet his own, and in that moment, Daniel experienced something that would alter the entire trajectory of everything that followed, because the eyes that looked back at him were eyes that Daniel had looked into 1,000 times, had seen in the mirror of genetic inheritance when Marco was born, eyes that belonged to a face that Daniel had last seen 3 years ago, cold and impossible in a hospital room. The man's expression shifted, and Daniel watched confusion cross his features, watched recognition begin to dawn, and the man opened his mouth as though to speak, but before any words could emerge, the aircraft hit turbulence, a sudden dropping sensation that caused Daniel to grip the back of the nearest seat, and when his vision cleared and his balance returned, when his inner ear had readjusted to the return of normal gravity, the man was already speaking, his voice uncertain, "Do I know you?" And Daniel found that he was unable to answer, found that his throat had become incapable of producing sound, found that he was experiencing something that modern neuroscience understood to be a kind of dissociation, a temporary breakdown in his sense of present reality that occurs when the mind is confronted with something that violates its fundamental assumptions about how the world is organized. Helena's husband, Marco's biological father, the man whose name was also Marco, the man who had been Daniel's partner for 15 years, the man who had died 3 years ago in a car accident on the highway, while traveling to a conference, was now sitting in a blue sweater on an airplane bound for Barcelona, looking at Daniel with polite confusion as though they had never met before, as though there had never been a shared life, a shared child, 15 years of mornings and evenings and ordinary days that had accumulated into something that should have been permanent, and Daniel's mind reeled with the kind of cognitive dissonance that can only be resolved through one of several possibilities. Either he was having a psychotic break and none of this was real, or he was misidentifying this stranger who merely resembled someone from his past, or something had happened to the fundamental structure of reality itself, something that did not have a place in any of the frameworks that had organized Daniel's understanding of what was possible. It was at this moment that Daniel's sister, Carmen, arrives in this story, though she is not on the airplane with them, but her presence would become essential to understanding everything that followed, because Carmen is a therapist like Daniel, though she works in a different city and has developed a particular specialization in trauma and dissociation, and when Daniel would later attempt to explain what he was experiencing, it would be Carmen's theoretical framework that would provide some structure to the chaos. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are moving too quickly through time when we should be staying in this moment, staying with Daniel and his incomprehension, staying with Marco in his seat still several rows back, his young face pressed against the back of the seat in front of him, trying to see what his father was doing, trying to understand what he had set in motion by whispering those dangerous words, that suggestion that had shattered the ordinary flow of the morning. Daniel heard himself saying something then, heard his own voice as though it was coming from somewhere outside his body, and he was asking, "Your name, what is your name?" And the man's face registered deeper confusion, greater concern, and he said slowly, as one might speak to someone who is clearly unwell, "My name is Marco, Marco Solis," and Daniel felt the world perform that impossible tilting motion again, because Marco Solis was the name of Helena's first husband, the man she had divorced 5 years before she met Daniel. The man she had left because he had decided that fatherhood and partnership were not the life he wanted after all, the man who had changed his mind and come back to want his son, but by then it was too late. Helena had found Daniel, or Daniel had found her, the way these things happen, and they had become a family, and Marco Solis had faded from their lives, had become a voice on the telephone occasionally, a name that appeared on documents occasionally, a biological fact that had become increasingly abstract as the years accumulated. But Marco Solis was not on this airplane, could not possibly be on this airplane, because 3 years ago, Helena's second husband, Marco's stepfather, the man who had raised him from age 2, the man who loved him without condition, that Marco had been the one to die, and Daniel had attended his funeral, had held his son as the small casket was lowered into the ground, had spent 3 years attempting to navigate the particular anguish that comes from losing someone you have loved with the fullness of your being, and now apparently the other Marco, the first Marco, the one who had abandoned his son in infancy, was sitting in an airplane aisle seat, and Daniel felt his mind producing a sound that was almost like laughter, a desperate, discordant laughter that bordered on the hysterical, because the only way any of this made sense was if he had finally lost whatever remaining coherence he had managed to maintain over these 3 years of grief. The flight attendant was suddenly there, her face registering concern, asking if everything was all right, "Sir," and Daniel realized that he must have looked quite distressed, and he was saying, "Yes, I am sorry, I am so sorry, I thought you were someone else," and he was backing away from the seat, returning to his own seat, where Marco was watching him with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face, eyes that had witnessed too much loss too early, eyes that still held the question, "Was I right? Was I right about what I saw?" And Daniel sat down beside his son and took his hand and said, "We need to talk about what just happened, but not here, not now. When we land, we will figure this out." The remainder of the flight passed in a state of time that felt somehow detached from normal progression, the minutes seeming simultaneously to stretch endlessly and to collapse upon themselves, and Daniel sat in his seat with his son's hand in his, and his mind was working in ways he could not quite control, generating hypothesis after hypothesis, each one more unlikely than the last, And he found himself thinking about his work with patients, about the ways that trauma can fragment memory, about the ways that grief can make the mind create false connections, and he wondered if perhaps Marco had experienced a kind of confabulation, had constructed a false memory that seemed utterly convincing because it was rooted in his deep unconscious desire for his father to return, for the impossible loss to be somehow undone. And Daniel knew something about this mechanism, understood it intellectually, had studied it in graduate school, but understanding something intellectually and experiencing it as a parent trying to help your child through inexplicable confusion were entirely different things. When the aircraft finally descended toward Barcelona, when the wheels touched down with that particular bump that always felt like a small miraculous defiance of physics, Daniel found himself unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that they had traveled through more than merely geographic space, that they had entered into a different version of the world. And as they gathered their small carry-on bags and made their way toward the exit, Daniel found himself turning back to look at the man in the blue sweater, found himself confirming once more that the man was indeed there, was indeed real, was not simply a projection of his own disturbed consciousness. Carmen met them at the arrival's gate, his sister with her dark hair and her warm eyes, the eyes that belonged to the same parents as Daniel, eyes that had witnessed the same childhood, the same family history, and Carmen embraced them both. But almost immediately she pulled back slightly and looked at Daniel's face with the particular intensity of someone trained to read the signs of emotional distress, and she said, "Something is wrong." And Daniel, not wanting to discuss it in front of Marco, simply shook his head and suggested they get to her apartment before attempting any conversations of significance, and Carmen drove them through the Barcelona streets, the Mediterranean light pouring through the windows, the city revealing itself in its complicated beauty, the architecture speaking of centuries of human ambition and loss and rebuilding. And Marco gazed out the window while Daniel stared at nothing in particular, and Carmen skillfully navigated the traffic while her mind was clearly working on the problem that she could sense her brother carrying. At Carmen's apartment, once Marco had been installed with juice and cookies and permission to use the television for a limited time, once they had created the small buffer of privacy that adults use to shield children from larger conversations, Carmen turned to Daniel and said simply, "Tell me," and Daniel told her everything, starting from the moment Marco had gripped his arm, moving through the impossible encounter on the airplane, including all the details that his mind kept producing and then rejecting, and Carmen listened with the quality of attention that comes from years of training, from understanding that sometimes the most important therapeutic work is simply to hear what someone is saying without rushing to explain it away or fix it. When Daniel had finished, Carmen was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Did you speak to him?" And Daniel said, "Barely," and Carmen nodded slowly, and she said, "I think we need to do something that might seem unconventional. I think we need to find out who this man is, really find out, not just assume that the impossible has happened, because sometimes the mind will leap to the most dramatic explanation when there are more mundane possibilities that we have overlooked," and Daniel felt a small unclenching in his chest at this suggestion, because Carmen was right. There could be explanations that existed between the impossible and the merely coincidental, and Carmen, with the practical efficiency of someone who works in the therapeutic world, began to piece together what they knew: the name Marco Solis, a man on a flight to Barcelona, a man who bore some resemblance to photographs that Daniel had only glimpsed years ago. And Carmen said, "I am going to make some calls. I know some people in this city, let me see what I can find out." While Carmen was on the telephone in her office, speaking in the low voice of someone conducting professional inquiries, Daniel found himself wandering to the window of her apartment, looking out at the city and thinking about a particular patient he had worked with years ago, a woman named Isabel, a woman who had come to see him because she was experiencing something that she called temporal displacement, an ongoing sense that she was living in multiple versions of time simultaneously, and Isabel had told him about the day she had seen her dead husband in a cafe, had seen him with absolute certainty, had pursued him through the streets until she had finally cornered him and discovered that he was a stranger who simply possessed a superficial resemblance. And Isabel had told Daniel that the grief of that moment, the second loss of discovering that her mind had played such a cruel trick on her, had nearly destroyed her, but it had also been the moment that had forced her to accept that her husband was truly gone, and that she had to begin the difficult work of learning to live in a world where he no longer existed, not even in her imagination. Daniel had been a good therapist for Isabel, had helped her navigate that particular pain, had used his training to support her through the process of accepting that sometimes our minds will give us what we most desperately want, regardless of whether such a thing is actually available. And now Daniel found himself wondering if he was being given the opportunity to experience what he had only witnessed before, to understand from the inside what it felt like when the mind's longing collides with the reality of what is possible and what is not. Carmen emerged from her office with a particular expression on her face, an expression that contained multiple pieces of information all at once, and she said, "I found him," and Daniel felt his stomach contract, and Carmen continued, "His name really is Marco Solis. He is 48 years old. He lives in Valencia. He works as a freelance translator, and get this, his ex-wife is named Helena. And 3 years ago he had a psychological crisis, something that his sister described as a complete break from reality, and he spent 6 weeks in a psychiatric hospital, and when he emerged from the hospital, he had no memory of the year that preceded his hospitalization, none at all, and the psychiatric report suggested that he had experienced a dissociative episode so severe that his mind had essentially deleted an entire year of his life, and Daniel felt the room perform a strange rotation, and he said, "Wait, what year did he lose?" And Carmen said, "Well, that is the interesting part, the year he lost covers the period that includes when his son was born." It took Daniel several moments to absorb what Carmen was suggesting, and then he understood, and the understanding arrived with such force that he had to sit down, had to allow his body to settle into the couch, and he said, "You mean he does not remember?" And Carmen said, "No, he does not remember his son being born, does not remember those early years of fatherhood, does not remember the marriage that led to that son. In fact, when he recovered, when he came out of the hospital, he had to be told about all of it, about Marco, about having been married, about everything that had happened during that year of his life." The implications of this information began to layer themselves into Daniel's consciousness, and he started to ask questions, and Carmen answered them as best she could based on the information that her professional contacts had been able to provide, and they pieced together a story that was stranger than fiction, more improbable than most things that occur in literature precisely because it was real, because it had actually happened to actual people, and the story went something like this. Marco Solis had lost a year of his life to mental illness, had lost the year in which his son was born, and when he had recovered, when he had regained consciousness in that hospital room, his mind had insisted that this lost year was also the year in which he had lived with Helena, had learned to be a father, and his memory had constructed instead a false continuity, had maintained that he had known his son and had chosen to leave him, rather than the stranger truth, which was that he had lost a year and had therefore missed his son's existence entirely, and the guilt of this, the shame of this, had been what motivated him to maintain minimal contact with his son over the years, contact that carried the weight of his secret knowledge that he could not really remember this child that he was supposedly connected to. And now, 3 years after Helena's death, 3 years after the man who had raised Marco had died, 3 years after Marco Solis's own mind had fragmented under the weight of this existential confusion, this man was traveling to Barcelona for some kind of medical consultation, and a young boy had recognized something in him that perhaps only children can recognize, something that goes beyond the surface level of resemblance, something that speaks to genetic memory or quantum entanglement or simply the particular way that a child's mind can perceive connections that adult rationality would dismiss. Carmen and Daniel sat in her apartment, and Carmen said, "So the question now is, what do we do with this information? Do we tell Marco that his biological father is on this island right now? Do we create the opportunity for them to meet, or do we protect him from the knowledge that his father might be close enough to touch?" And Daniel found that he did not have an immediate answer, found that this decision required the kind of careful ethical consideration that is at the heart of therapeutic work, the recognition that simply having information does not automatically mean that sharing that information is the right thing to do. They discussed Marco's emotional state over the past 3 years, how he had grieved for the man who had actually raised him, how he had gradually integrated the loss into his life, how the wound had begun to form scar tissue, how he had started to emerge into the possibility of joy again. And they discussed what it might mean to suddenly introduce the biological father back into his life when that father himself was still working through his own trauma and fragmentation. And Carmen said, in her particular wisdom, sometimes we have to accept that the people we love are not capable of giving us what we most want from them. Sometimes we have to accept that our version of them, the version our mind has constructed, is all that we will ever truly have, and that might have to be enough. That evening, after Marco had fallen asleep on Carmen's couch, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by pillows, Daniel stood on Carmen's balcony overlooking the city, and he thought about the nature of identity, about what makes a father, about whether it is genetic material or presence, about whether it is intention or simply showing up day after day after day, and he thought about the man he had loved for 15 years, the man named Marco Solis who had been his son's stepfather, and he understood something that he had not fully grasped before, which was that the two men, despite sharing the same genetic legacy for his son, were fundamentally different people, and the one who mattered, the one who had actually been a father, was the one who was gone, was the one whose name was now on a death certificate rather than a passport. And Daniel thought about the woman named Patricia, a patient he had seen years ago, a woman who had spent her entire childhood believing that her biological father was one man, only to discover at age 25 that he was actually a different man, that her mother had engaged in a deception that had fractured Patricia's sense of identity. And Patricia had told Daniel that what had hurt the most was not the deception itself, but rather the sudden recognition that the man she had called father, the man she had built her identity in relation to, was not actually connected to her by biology, and yet, Patricia had said, in some ways that had freed her from the idea that she had to be a certain way because of genetic inheritance, had freed her to understand that identity is something we construct through relationship and not something that is transmitted through DNA like a virus. Daniel understood that Marco was at an age where such knowledge could be profoundly destabilizing or profoundly liberating, depending on how it was presented and integrated, and he understood that his responsibility was not to shield his son from difficult truths forever, but rather to help him navigate those truths at a pace that his developing nervous system could integrate without shattering. The next morning, Daniel sat down with Marco and said, "I want to tell you about something," and Marco's entire body became attentive, because Marco had learned in his 11 years of life that when adults said they wanted to tell you something, it usually meant that the world was about to shift in ways that you could not predict. And Daniel told him about Marco Solis, about the man on the airplane, about who he was and why he might have seemed familiar, and Daniel explained that Marco Solis was his biological father, but that he was also a man who had experienced a lot of pain and confusion in his life, and that Daniel was not sure what it would be good for him to know right now. And Daniel asked Marco what he thought, what he wanted to know, and Marco, with the particular honesty that children often possess, said, "Does he remember me?" And Daniel paused, and then he said, "No, buddy, he does not remember you." And Marco seemed to absorb this information, seemed to turn it over in his mind, and then he said, "Okay," and that was all he said. And Daniel understood that his son had just made a decision, that Marco had decided that this man who did not remember him was not actually his father in any way that mattered, and that the person who had been his father was the man who had died, the man who had shown up every day, the man whose loss had shaped the past 3 years of Marco's life. And in the days that followed, Daniel and Carmen and Marco moved through Barcelona as though they had entered a story that had already been written, moving through the same streets that Marco Solis was presumably also moving through, existing in the same city without connecting, and Daniel found himself thinking about the concept of parallel universes, about the idea that there might be multiple versions of the same moment happening at the same time, and in some versions Marco and his biological father might meet and reconcile, and in other versions they might continue to pass each other like ships in the night, never quite finding the frequency on which to communicate. But there was another story that was unfolding simultaneously with this one, and it was the story of how Daniel himself was being transformed by these events, how he was being forced to examine his own grief in ways that he had managed to avoid for 3 years, and this story took him back to a particular afternoon in the weeks after the funeral, when Daniel had been sorting through the man's belongings, through the things that accumulated over 15 years of shared life, and he had found in a drawer a letter that had never been sent, a letter that the man named Marco had written to his biological father, a letter that he had composed but never mailed, and the letter was addressed to Marco Solis, and it said, "I do not know if you are my real father or if the other Marco is. All I know is that both of you have left me in different ways, one by dying and one by not knowing me. And I am trying to figure out how to be a person whose origin story includes this kind of abandonment, and I am wondering if there is something about me that makes fathers leave." And Daniel had wept when he read this letter, had wept for the child who had written it, had wept for the confusion and pain that had been living in his son's body all this time. And reading that letter had changed something in Daniel, had made him understand that he had been trying to protect Marco from pain rather than helping him understand and process it. And so now, in Barcelona, Daniel was beginning a different kind of work with his son, was beginning to help him develop a more complex and mature understanding of what it meant that he had two fathers, one biological and one social, and that both of them had failed him in different ways, and that he would have to learn to integrate both the presence and the absence into a coherent sense of self. They visited the cemetery where Marco's stepfather was buried, and they sat beside his grave, and Marco talked about memories, about the smell of his father's cologne, about the way his father would whistle while making breakfast, about the feeling of his father's hand on his shoulder when he was scared. And as Marco talked, Daniel was silent, was present, was allowing his son to construct and reconstruct his relationship with loss. And Daniel understood that this was the work that needed to happen, not a dramatic reunion with a biological father who could not remember him, but rather the ongoing work of integrating the people we have loved into the architecture of our consciousness, of understanding that they continue to exist in us even when their bodies no longer exist in the world. On their final day in Barcelona, Daniel did something that surprised himself, and he went to the hotel where he knew Marco Solis was staying, and he asked for him at the front desk, and within minutes he was standing in an elevator ascending to the 7th floor, and his heart was performing unusual rhythms, and his mind was generating multiple narratives about what he would say, what he wanted to communicate to this man. And when Marco Solis opened the door, when he stood there in his hotel room with an expression of confused recognition, Daniel found that words were not what emerged from his mouth at all, but rather silence, and a kind of acceptance, and Daniel said simply, "I wanted to see you, to confirm that you are real," and Marco Solis said, "I am real, though I am not sure why that should matter to you," and Daniel said, "Because my son saw you on an airplane and thought you were his father." And Marco Solis's entire body seemed to rearrange itself, and he said, "My son," and Daniel said, "Yes, your biological son. He is 11 years old. He lost his stepfather 3 years ago, and he is trying to understand the meaning of fatherhood and absence." And Marco Solis began to cry then, began to cry with the kind of grief that comes from understanding all at once something that you have been unable to see clearly, and he said, "I do not remember him." And Daniel said, "I know," and Marco Solis said, "But I should remember him," and Daniel said, "Perhaps, but you did not, and that is not something we can change now." And Marco Solis sat on the edge of the hotel bed and wept, and Daniel sat beside him, and for a moment these two men who had both been fathers to the same child existed in the same room, and they did not speak, because there was nothing that words could do that silence could not do better. When Daniel left the hotel room, when he stepped back into the Barcelona afternoon, he found that something had shifted inside him, something had moved into a different configuration, and he called Carmen and said, "I met him," and Carmen said, "How was it?" and Daniel said, "It was necessary," and Carmen said, "That is usually what these meetings turn out to be." The flight back to Madrid felt different from the flight to Barcelona, felt like they were traveling in reverse not just through geographic space but through time itself, moving back toward the life that they had constructed, the life that did not include the possibility of reunion with biological fathers, the life that was built on the presence of those who had chosen to stay, on the love that had been expressed through showing up. And Marco slept against the window, his face peaceful, and Daniel found himself thinking about a piece of neuroscience that he had read years ago. Something about how the brain forms attachments not on the basis of genetic material but on the basis of consistent nurturing interactions, on the basis of the release of oxytocin that occurs when a caregiver shows up repeatedly for a child. And Daniel understood that no amount of biological connection could replicate the neural pathways that had been formed over 11 years of daily care and attention and love. Back in their apartment in Madrid, in the weeks and months that followed, Daniel began to do something that he had been avoiding. He began to go through the process of properly grieving the loss of his partner, began to access the feelings that he had been suppressing in his attempt to be strong for Marco, began to allow himself to cry and rage and feel the full weight of the absence, and in doing so, Daniel found that he was modeling for his son a different kind of emotional honesty, a different kind of presence with pain, and Marco began to respond to this, began to share his own grief in more direct and authentic ways, and they began to reconstruct their life together not as a recovery of what had been lost, but as a new creation, a new architecture built on the foundation of the old but shaped by what they had learned through loss. One evening, 6 months after the Barcelona trip, Marco came into the kitchen where Daniel was preparing dinner, and Marco said, "Do you think I will ever meet Marco Solis again?" And Daniel said, "I do not know, that depends on many things, some of which are within his control and some of which are within yours." And Marco said, "I think maybe it would be okay if I did." And Daniel said, "I think so too." And Marco said, "But it would not be like meeting a father, would it?" And Daniel said, "No, it would be something different, something more complicated and more real." And Marco seemed satisfied with this answer, seemed to understand that the world is populated with relationships that do not fit neatly into the categories we have learned to use. Over time, they did establish contact with Marco Solis, did build a relationship that was tentative and complicated and genuine, and it turned out that Marco Solis, in his own process of recovery and healing, had begun to want to know the son who had been born during the year that his mind had deleted, and the meetings were awkward and difficult and occasionally beautiful. And Marco learned that he had a biological father who was a real person with real flaws and real struggles, and Daniel learned that the role of stepfather had given him something that biology could never give, which was the privilege of being chosen, of being the one who showed up, and Marco Solis learned that it was never too late to begin the work of becoming someone worthy of love, even when you had missed the early years, even when you had to construct the relationship from the fragments of what you had been unable to remember. This story, the story of a whisper on an airplane, is in the end not about whether dead people can come back, or about the impossibility of loss, or about the magical thinking that sometimes accompanies grief. It is rather a story about how we construct our identities in relation to the people who show up for us, how we learn to love in the presence of inevitable loss, how we develop the capacity to hold multiple truths simultaneously, how we integrate the people who have shaped us into something that persists even when their bodies have stopped persisting. And it is a story about a boy who glimpsed something in a stranger's face that his conscious mind did not recognize but his deeper consciousness understood. And it is a story about how sometimes our children see things that we cannot see, not because they are more perceptive in a literal sense, but because they are still living in a world where the boundaries between the possible and the impossible have not yet solidified into the rigid structures that define adult consciousness. And it is a story about how grief, properly metabolized, properly felt, properly integrated, can become the foundation for a more authentic and genuine way of living in the world. Years later, when Marco would be old enough to understand the fuller complexity of what had happened, when he would be a teenager beginning to form his own identity in relation to the events that had shaped his childhood, Daniel would take him to see Carmen, would allow his sister to work with Marco in her therapeutic practice, and Carmen would help Marco understand the neuroscience behind what had happened on that airplane, would explain how the brain can recognize patterns even when the conscious mind is not processing them, how the amygdala, that ancient alarm system, can detect something in a face or a posture that speaks to deep genetic memory, and Marco would begin to understand that what he had experienced was not hallucination or confusion, but rather a kind of knowing that exists outside the normal channels of conscious awareness. And this understanding would become part of the narrative that Marco constructed about himself, about his capacity to perceive things that others might miss, and it would become one of his strengths rather than one of his vulnerabilities. And Daniel, in his work as a therapist, would begin to incorporate the lessons of his own experience into his practice, would begin to understand in a new and deeper way the impact of loss on the nervous system, would begin to recognize how trauma can fragment our sense of who we are, and he would work with patients like Patricia, the woman who had discovered that her biological father was not the man she had believed him to be, with greater compassion and nuance, understanding that identity is not fixed but rather a process of continuous reconstruction, and he would work with people like Isabel, the woman who had seen her dead husband in a cafe, with a deeper recognition of what it means to grieve, what it means to have your mind offer you false comfort even as your body knows the truth of absence. In the years that followed, Marcos Solis would gradually reconstruct his relationship with his son, would move into a role that was neither fully father nor fully stranger, but rather something in between, something that did not have a name in the traditional vocabulary of family relations. And while Marco would never recover the lost year that had been deleted from his mind, he would come to understand that loss as his own particular scar, his own entry point into understanding what it means to be human, what it means to navigate a world that does not always make sense, and he would find within that loss a kind of compassion for his son's own losses, and the two of them would develop a relationship built not on shared history but on the recognition of shared pain. And this relationship would become real in ways that purely genetic connections sometimes fail to become real. Daniel would continue to carry the memory of the man he had loved for 15 years, would continue to feel his presence in the small moments of daily life, would continue to find him in Marco's gestures and expressions and ways of thinking, and over time, Daniel would come to understand that this was exactly how people persist after death, not through some magical reappearance, not through the intervention of forces beyond the natural world, but through their continued presence in the neural pathways of those who loved them, through the way they have shaped the brains and hearts of those they touched, and Daniel would come to see that this form of continuity, though less dramatic than literal resurrection, was in some ways more profound, more real, more textured with the complexity of actual human love. And Carmen, Daniel's sister, would continue to work in her therapeutic practice in Barcelona, would continue to help people navigate the impossible terrain of grief and loss, would continue to hold space for people who were confused about the nature of their own experience, and Carmen would sometimes tell the story of her brother's encounter on the airplane, would use it to illustrate points about how the mind works, about how we construct meaning from ambiguity, about how sometimes the most important insights come not from understanding what is true but from learning to live in the space where multiple truths can coexist without resolving into a single narrative. There is a particular moment that occurred about 2 years after the Barcelona trip, a moment that brought all of these threads together, and in this moment Daniel was sitting in a cafe in Madrid with his son, and they were having one of their regular conversations, the conversations that had become a kind of ritual since the loss. Conversations where they checked in with each other, where they maintained the particular intimacy that shared grief can create, and Marco said to his father, "Dad, do you think that what I saw on the airplane was real, or do you think that my brain made it up?" And Daniel paused, and he considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, and he said, "I think it was both. I think your brain perceived something that was real, but your brain also interpreted that thing through the lens of what you most wanted to see. And I think the truth is that sometimes these two things cannot be separated. Sometimes what we want is so intertwined with what is that we cannot draw a clear line between them." And Marco seemed to consider this, and then he said, "So in a way, I created the thing I saw," and Daniel said, "Yes, in a way you did, and in a way the thing existed independently of your creation, and both of those things are true." And Marco smiled then. Smiled in a way that suggested he understood that the world was more complicated and more interesting than simple categories of real and not real, and Daniel felt a warmth move through his chest at this smile, at the recognition that his son was growing, was developing the capacity to hold complexity, was learning to live in ambiguity without needing to resolve it. On the anniversary of the man's death, on the day that the calendar marked 3 years and then 4 years and then 5 years since the funeral, Daniel and Marco would go to the cemetery together, and they would sit beside the grave, and they would talk about memories. And as the years passed and Marco grew taller and his voice deepened and he began to move through the world as a teenager and eventually as a young man, the content of what they discussed would change, but the ritual remained the same, and through this ritual they maintained their relationship with the man who had shaped them both, maintained the connection across the boundary that death had drawn. And eventually Marco would grow into adulthood, would develop his own relationships, his own understanding of what it means to be a father or a partner or a person who carries the inheritance of loss into the construction of a life. And Marco would sometimes think back to that moment on the airplane, would sometimes think about the strange and impossible recognition that had occurred, and he would come to understand it as one of the defining moments of his consciousness, a moment when the world had revealed itself to be stranger and more complicated than he had previously believed, and Marco would carry this understanding with him, would allow it to shape his capacity for compassion, would allow it to open him to the recognition that other people's experiences of reality might be valid even when they seemed impossible or unlikely or statistically improbable. There is a final piece of this story that brings everything together, and it comes several years after the initial encounter, and by this time Daniel had done extensive reading about what is sometimes called the sixth sense, or the recognition beyond recognition, that children sometimes seem to possess. And he had read about studies suggesting that the brain contains mirror neurons. Neurons that fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing that action, and these mirror neurons seem to suggest that at some deep neurological level, we are recognizing and copying and understanding the people around us in ways that go far beyond conscious awareness. And Daniel had also read about research suggesting that we inherit not just genes but also epigenetic markers, molecular signals that carry information about trauma and stress and emotion across generations. And while this research was speculative and controversial, Daniel found in it a possible framework for understanding what had happened on the airplane, understanding it not as magic or impossibility, but as the recognition of something real that existed below the level of conscious perception. And Daniel had come to believe that what Marco had experienced was a form of this kind of deep recognition, that his son's body had recognized something about Marco's Solis that went beyond superficial resemblance, something in the posture or the movement or the presence that carried genetic information, and that Marco's consciousness had then constructed the narrative of recognition, had then created the story that made sense of the data that his nervous system had already collected, and this understanding did not diminish what had happened, did not make it less real, but rather gave it a different kind of reality, a reality grounded in neuroscience and biology rather than in magic or the supernatural. And as Daniel reflected on all of this, as he integrated his own experience into his understanding of how the human mind and body work, Daniel came to recognize that the real miracle of that moment on the airplane was not that the dead had returned or that the laws of physics had been suspended, but rather that a child had perceived something true about a stranger, had recognized in that stranger a connection to his own identity and history, and had had the courage to name what he was perceiving even though it violated the everyday assumptions about what was possible. And Daniel came to understand that this courage, this willingness to speak a truth that seems impossible, is one of the most important capacities that human beings possess, because it is this capacity that allows us to grow, that allows us to transcend the limitations of our previous understanding, that allows us to build new and more inclusive maps of what is possible. In the end, this story is not really about ghosts or impossibilities or the suspension of natural law. This story is about how we love each other, about how that love persists even when the bodies we love have stopped existing, about how we pass something of ourselves into the people we touch, about how the neural pathways that we create through relationship and attention and care become the foundation of how those we love perceive and understand the world. And this story is about a father and son learning to live with loss, learning to integrate that loss into a more complex understanding of what it means to be human, learning to recognize that the people we have loved do not truly leave us, they simply change form, simply exist now in the structure of our consciousness rather than in the physicality of the world, and this understanding, properly integrated, properly metabolized, becomes not a source of pain but a source of strength, becomes the foundation upon which we can build our capacity to love others, to show up for others, to be present for others in the ways that matter most. And Marco, now grown into adulthood, now carrying forward his own understanding of what it means to navigate a world that contains both loss and connection, both absence and presence, would sometimes reflect on that moment on the airplane, and would feel a kind of gratitude, not for the impossible encounter itself, but for the way that moment had opened him to deeper truths about human connection, about the invisible threads that bind us to one another, about the ways that love persists across time and space and even across the boundary of death. And Marco would carry this gratitude with him into the way that he related to others, into the way that he showed up in relationships, into the way that he tried to be present for the people that he loved, understanding that the greatest gift we can give to those we love is not the promise that we will always be there, but rather the promise that we will be here now, fully present, fully attentive, fully committed to the daily work of building and maintaining connection. And this promise, this commitment, this daily showing up, is ultimately what fatherhood is about, what partnership is about, what human love is fundamentally built upon.